Sometimes the loneliest person in the ballroom is the one standing beside the birthday cake. Snow drifted softly beyond the towering windows of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, while Manhattan shimmered beneath winter light like a city wrapped in diamonds. Inside the crystal ballroom, golden chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors and rows of champagne glasses, while New York's wealthiest families gathered beneath warm piano music and soft conversation. Every table glowed with candles. Every server moved carefully between silk dresses and tailored suits. Every detail had been designed to perfection by billionaire Daniel Whitmore. Because tonight was supposed to repair something he no longer understood how to reach. His daughter, Sophie Whitmore, sat near the center of the ballroom beside a towering white birthday cake decorated with silver sugar roses and tiny glass lights woven through the frosting like stars. 16 years old. White satin dress. Blonde hair falling softly against her shoulders. Beautiful enough for magazine covers. Quiet enough to disappear completely in a room full of people. Guests approached her one by one throughout the evening with expensive gifts and polished smiles. Sophie thanked each person politely, then returned to silence again. Daniel noticed every second of it from across the ballroom. The billionaire stood near the stage speaking with investors while adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit jacket, but his eyes kept drifting back toward the same empty expression on his daughter's face. She looks tired, one guest whispered softly nearby. She looks sad, another answered. Daniel pretended not to hear either comment. Emily Carter moved carefully through the ballroom, carrying a silver tray filled with champagne beneath the chandelier light. Black waitress uniform. Silver name tag near the collar. Calm blue eyes that noticed things most people missed. She had worked enough luxury events to understand how wealthy families learn to smile without speaking honestly to each other. But something about Sophie Whitmore unsettled her quietly tonight. The girl kept glancing toward one specific chair near the ballroom windows. An empty chair. Nobody sat there. Nobody touched the place setting. Yet Sophie looked at it every few minutes like someone still belonged there. Emily slowed slightly while passing nearby. A small framed photograph rested almost hidden beside the candles at the table. A woman smiling warmly beneath summer sunlight. Sophie's mother. Emily understood immediately. 3 years earlier, Manhattan newspapers covered the story for weeks after Amelia Whitmore passed away unexpectedly from illness. Emily remembered the headlines because the photographs never looked real. Beautiful billionaire family shattered overnight. But newspapers only captured polished grief. Not the quiet kind that lingered years later beside empty chairs during birthday dinners. Across the ballroom, Daniel finally approached Sophie's table holding 2 champagne glasses while guests watched him carefully. Powerful men attracted attention even when silent. "You have barely touched your cake," he said gently. Sophie forced a small smile without meeting his eyes. "I am not hungry." Daniel sat beside her slowly. "Your friends came all this way tonight." Sophie looked around the ballroom filled with laughter, music, diamonds, and strangers pretending intimacy for photographs. "I know." Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "Can you at least try to enjoy yourself?" Sophie stared down at the silver fork beside her untouched dessert plate. "I am trying." The sentence carried no anger. Somehow that made it sadder. Nearby guests awkwardly returned to conversation, while Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. He built companies worth billions of dollars. Negotiated mergers across continents. Controlled rooms filled with powerful people. Yet sitting beside his daughter felt harder than facing financial collapse ever had. Emily quietly approached the table to refill water glasses. Sophie glanced up briefly while Emily carefully poured sparkling water beneath the candlelight. Their eyes met for only a second. But Emily recognized something immediately. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. The kind carried by people who spent too long pretending they were fine for everyone else's comfort. Daniel noticed Sophie looking toward the waitress and immediately straightened slightly. "We are fine here," he said coldly toward Emily without even checking the glasses. Emily nodded politely. "Of course, sir." She turned to leave quietly when Sophie suddenly spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. "Wait." Emily paused beside the table. Sophie looked toward the silver tray in her hands. "Is the hot chocolate station still open?" Daniel blinked slightly in surprise. "You want hot chocolate?" Sophie shrugged faintly. "Maybe." Emily smiled softly. "I can bring some right away." Daniel interrupted immediately. Sophie, there is imported dessert wine at your table. Sophie lowered her eyes again. I know. Emily noticed the shift instantly. The girl did not want luxury tonight. She wanted comfort. There was a difference wealthy people often forgot. I will bring it, Emily said gently before walking toward the ballroom kitchen beneath the warm chandelier glow. Daniel watched her disappear through the crowd, while irritation tightened slightly across his expression. The waitress had spoken to Sophie for less than 30 seconds and somehow already reached her more naturally than half the guests inside the ballroom. Near the kitchen entrance, Emily prepared the hot chocolate carefully instead of rushing. Whipped cream, small cinnamon dusting, tiny chocolate curls resting across the surface. Simple things mattered when someone felt emotionally invisible. When she returned to the ballroom several minutes later, Sophie remained alone at the table while Daniel spoke with investors near the stage again. Emily quietly placed the warm cup beside Sophie beneath the candlelight. Steam curled softly into the air between them. Thank you, Sophie whispered. Emily glanced briefly toward the empty chair near the windows before speaking carefully. Sometimes birthdays hurt more than people expect. Sophie froze slightly after hearing that. Her fingers tightened gently around the cup. What do you mean? Emily offered the smallest smile. Sometimes the person you wish was there becomes the only person you can see. Silence settled between them beneath the soft piano music drifting across the ballroom. Sophie stared down into the hot chocolate, while her eyes slowly filled with emotion. She clearly spent years hiding from rooms exactly like this one. And across the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore looked back toward the table just in time to see his daughter wiping away the first tear she had allowed herself to show all night. The moment Sophie Whitmore wiped away that tear, the entire ballroom seemed to change temperature. Not because anyone else noticed immediately. Most guests continued laughing softly beneath the chandeliers while waiters carried silver trays through pools of golden light, and piano music drifted slowly across the marble floors. But Daniel Whitmore noticed. A father always notices the first crack in a wall his child spent years building around herself. From across the ballroom, the billionaire stared toward the table near the windows where Sophie sat holding the untouched cup of hot chocolate between both hands while Emily Carter stood quietly beside her. Sophie never cried in public. Not after the funeral. Not after the tabloids. Not after months of strangers pretending sympathy in front of cameras. Daniel had not seen tears in his daughter's eyes for almost 3 years. Yet somehow a waitress carrying cinnamon-topped hot chocolate had reached a place inside Sophie that he no longer knew how to touch. Daniel excused himself abruptly from the investors surrounding him and crossed the ballroom beneath warm chandelier light, with controlled steps and tightening frustration hidden beneath his polished expression. Guests instinctively moved aside for him. Wealth changed the air around people. Emily noticed him approaching immediately. Sophie did too. The girl quickly lowered her eyes toward the cup in her hands, as if ashamed of being seen emotional. Daniel stopped beside the table. What happened? His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it now. Sophie shook her head lightly. Nothing. Daniel looked toward Emily next. What did you say to her? Nearby guests subtly quieted while pretending not to listen. Emily answered honestly. I only brought her hot chocolate. Daniel's gray eyes narrowed slightly. And Emily glanced briefly towards Sophie before speaking carefully. And I told her sometimes people miss someone even more during celebrations. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. You think discussing my wife with my daughter during her birthday party is appropriate? Sophie finally looked up. Dad. But Daniel continued watching Emily now with the cold focus of a man used to controlling rooms before conversations could turn unpredictable. You are here to serve tables, he said quietly. Not involve yourself in private family matters. Emily lowered her eyes respectfully. I understand, sir. Sophie's fingers tightened around the warm cup. She was only being kind. Daniel softened slightly toward his daughter, but not toward Emily. That is not the point. Around them, conversations resumed cautiously beneath the chandeliers, though several guests continued observing discreetly from nearby tables. Emily nodded once and stepped back gently. I apologize if I overstepped. Then she quietly returned toward the ballroom service station, carrying her silver tray beneath the golden light. Daniel sat beside Sophie immediately afterward. You should not let strangers upset you tonight. Sophie stared into the swirling steam above the cup. She did not upset me. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Then why are you crying? Sophie hesitated. The answer lived too deep to explain quickly. Finally, she whispered, because she noticed. Daniel frowned faintly. Noticed what? Sophie glanced toward the empty chair beside the windows where candlelight flickered softly against untouched silverware. That mom is still missing from this room. Silence settled heavily between them. Daniel looked toward the chair slowly. He had arranged the ballroom personally. Flowers imported from Paris. Ice sculptures. Musicians. Security. Custom desserts. Everything perfect. Yet somehow he never noticed the empty chair becoming the loudest thing in the room for his daughter. Sophie wiped another tear quickly before standing from the table. I need some air. Daniel immediately stood too. Sophie. But she was already walking toward the balcony hallway beside the ballroom windows beneath drifting reflections of snow outside. Guests quietly looked away as she passed. Nobody knew how to react to sadness inside expensive rooms. Daniel remained standing beside the table while frustration and guilt tangled together beneath his composed expression. Across the ballroom, Emily quietly arranged fresh dessert plates near the service station while another waitress whispered softly beside her. What happened? Emily kept her eyes lowered. Nothing important. But inside she already regretted speaking so openly to Sophie. Not because the words were wrong. Because grief became dangerous whenever wealthy people tried to control it instead of feel it. Daniel crossed the ballroom toward the service station several moments later. His expression remained calm enough for strangers. Not for Emily. A word, he said quietly. Emily followed him toward a quieter hallway beside the ballroom entrance where snow-covered Manhattan shimmered beyond tall glass windows. The music sounded distant there. Softer. Daniel turned toward her once they stood alone beneath the amber wall lights. I need you to understand something. Emily listened silently. My daughter has spent years rebuilding herself after losing her mother. His voice lowered carefully. I do not appreciate strangers reopening wounds she worked very hard to survive. Emily nodded gently. I understand why you are protective. Daniel crossed his arms. Do you? Emily met his eyes calmly for the first time all evening. Yes. Snow drifted behind the windows while warm hallway light reflected softly across the polished floor between them. Daniel studied her expression with growing irritation. She never looked intimidated. Only sad for him somehow. You seem to think you understand my daughter very quickly, he said coldly. Emily shook her head. No, her voice stayed soft. I think I understand loneliness very quickly. Daniel almost laughed once beneath his breath. Loneliness. Emily looked toward the ballroom, where distant laughter echoed beneath chandeliers. Sometimes people become lonelier after losing someone because everyone else becomes uncomfortable hearing their name. Daniel's jaw tightened subtly. You know nothing about my family. Emily lowered her eyes again respectfully. You are right. Silence stretched briefly between them. Then Emily quietly added, but your daughter keeps staring at the chair beside the window because nobody else is. Daniel looked toward the ballroom entrance slowly after hearing that. And for the first time all night, the billionaire realized he had spent 3 years removing every visible reminder of his wife from their lives because he thought protecting Sophie meant helping her avoid grief. But maybe all he really taught his daughter was how to mourn silently. The snow outside Manhattan thickened as the night moved deeper, wrapping the city in soft white silence while warmth and music continued glowing inside the crystal ballroom. Yet beneath the golden chandeliers, something fragile had shifted after Sophie Whitmore left the table. Conversations still floated through the air. Champagne glasses still clinked gently against polished silver trays. But Daniel Whitmore could no longer hear the ballroom the same way. Emily Carter returned quietly to work after their conversation near the hallway windows, though she noticed Daniel watching the empty chair beside the ballroom table more often now. The billionaire remained near the center of the room, speaking with guests mechanically, while his attention kept drifting toward the balcony corridor where Sophie disappeared nearly 15 minutes earlier. Finally, one investor touched Daniel lightly on the arm. Your daughter all right? Daniel forced a polite smile. She just needed air. But even he heard how uncertain his own answer sounded. Across the ballroom, Emily carefully placed dessert plates onto a serving station while another waitress whispered softly beside her. You should not have gotten involved. Emily nodded faintly. I know. He looked upset. Emily glanced briefly toward Daniel, standing beneath chandelier light, surrounded by powerful men discussing markets and investments like nothing emotional had happened tonight. Sometimes people look angry when they are actually hurting. The other waitress blinked slightly after hearing that. Near the ballroom stage, Daniel finally excused himself from another conversation and walked toward the balcony hallway where Sophie disappeared earlier. Snow reflected softly against the long glass corridor outside, while the distant sound of piano music echoed through the marble walls. He found Sophie standing alone near the balcony doors, staring out at the snowy Manhattan skyline below. Her white satin dress shimmered faintly beneath the hallway lights, while her arms wrapped tightly around herself against emotions she clearly no longer knew how to hide. Daniel slowed his steps. Sophie. She did not turn immediately. I am fine. The sentence sounded practiced. Automatic. Daniel leaned lightly against the marble wall nearby. You always say that. Sophie finally looked toward him with tired blue eyes that looked far older than 16 tonight. Because every time I say anything else, people get uncomfortable. Daniel opened his mouth slightly, then stopped. He had no prepared response for honesty anymore. Not from her. Snow drifted quietly beyond the balcony windows while silence settled between them again. Sophie looked back toward the city lights below. Do you know what I remember most about Mom? Daniel's chest tightened subtly. What? Sophie smiled sadly. She always noticed when people felt invisible. The sentence landed harder than she realized. Daniel immediately thought of Emily carrying hot chocolate beneath chandelier light, while quietly noticing the empty chair everyone else ignored. Sophie continued softly. After she died, everyone kept trying to make things normal again. Her eyes lowered. But nobody ever talked about her. Daniel swallowed carefully. I thought it would make things easier. Sophie shook her head faintly. It only made it lonely. Inside the ballroom, Emily moved slowly between tables while guests continued celebrating beneath warm golden light. Yet her attention kept drifting toward the empty hallway where Daniel and Sophie disappeared. Something about the girl's sadness stayed with her now. Not dramatic sadness. Quiet sadness. The kind wealthy families learned to hide beautifully. Near the service station, the ballroom manager approached Emily carefully. Mr. Whitmore is asking for another bottle of champagne at table 6. Emily nodded politely and lifted a silver tray. As she crossed the ballroom again beneath the chandeliers, several guests subtly glanced toward her now with growing curiosity. News traveled quickly in elegant rooms. Especially emotional news. Emily ignored the attention and approached Daniel's table quietly, just as Sophie and her father returned from the hallway. Sophie's eyes looked slightly red now, though she carried herself carefully. Daniel pulled out her chair gently before sitting beside her again. Emily noticed the small gesture immediately. Maybe Sophie noticed too. Emily reached forward to pour champagne for nearby guests when Daniel suddenly spoke without looking at her. Leave the bottle. His voice remained calm, but colder than before. Emily nodded once. Of course, sir. As she turned to leave, Daniel added quietly. And perhaps from now on, keep conversations with my daughter professional. The sentence carried enough weight for nearby guests to hear it clearly. Several conversations softened awkwardly around the table. Sophie looked down immediately. Emily paused only briefly before answering softly. I never meant disrespect. Daniel finally looked up at her directly. Intentions are not always the issue. The ballroom seemed quieter after that. Emily lowered her eyes respectfully and stepped away, carrying the silver tray against her side, while whispers moved carefully between nearby guests. Sophie watched her leave with visible discomfort. Dad. Daniel took a slow sip from his champagne glass. What? She was trying to help. Daniel's jaw tightened subtly beneath the chandelier glow. People who work for us should understand boundaries. Sophie stared at him for several seconds after hearing that, then softly asked the question he least expected. Do you really think kindness only belongs to people with money? Daniel froze slightly. Nearby laughter echoed faintly from another table, while snow continued drifting beyond the ballroom windows. Sophie looked toward the empty chair again. Mom never talked to people like that. Daniel looked down slowly at the untouched birthday cake, still glowing beneath tiny silver lights. For a moment, the billionaire suddenly felt exhausted in a way success could not fix. Across the ballroom, Emily quietly arranged fresh candles near another table while pretending she had not heard any of it. Yet her hands moved slower now beneath the warm golden lights. Because sometimes the hardest part about serving powerful people was not the disrespect itself. It was watching wounded people mistake control for strength. Near the ballroom stage, the musicians slowly transitioned into softer piano melodies while guests returned to conversation again. But Daniel no longer heard celebration around him tonight. Only absence, his daughter's silence, the empty chair beside the windows, and the gentle voice of a waitress who somehow understood the emotional distance inside his family before he did. The crystal ballroom glittered beautifully beneath the chandeliers, but by 11 o'clock the warmth inside the room felt almost artificial. Snow pressed softly against the towering Manhattan windows, while piano melodies floated through the air like something trying too hard to soothe people who no longer knew how to feel comfortable with silence. Guests continued drinking champagne. Investors continued discussing markets and acquisitions. Yet beneath the polished conversations and elegant laughter, an invisible tension lingered around the Whitmore family table near the windows. Sophie Whitmore sat quietly beside her untouched birthday cake, while candlelight flickered against the framed photograph of her mother resting near the empty chair. Daniel Whitmore remained beside her, though emotionally he still looked miles away. The billionaire spent most of the evening answering business calls, greeting influential guests, and pretending control could substitute for closeness. Sophie noticed. Children always notice the distance adults believe they hide well. Across the ballroom, Emily Carter carefully folded fresh linen napkins near the dessert station while trying not to think about the earlier conversation with Daniel. She understood his anger more than he realized. Grief made people protective, especially wealthy people accustomed to controlling every variable in life except death. Still, something about Sophie stayed heavy in Emily's mind. The girl looked less like someone celebrating a birthday and more like someone surviving one. Near the ballroom stage, Daniel suddenly tapped a silver spoon lightly against a champagne glass. The soft ringing sound slowly pulled conversations toward silence beneath the chandeliers. Guests turned toward him immediately. Powerful men understood how to command rooms even while emotionally lost inside them. Daniel lifted his champagne glass slightly. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Warm applause scattered politely through the ballroom. Sophie lowered her eyes toward the table. Daniel continued speaking beneath the golden lights. "This evening means a great deal to my daughter and to our family." Emily watched Sophie carefully after hearing that sentence. The girl's expression tightened almost invisibly. Daniel smiled toward the guests with polished billionaire confidence. "After difficult years, tonight is about moving forward together." More applause followed. Investors raised glasses. Camera flashes sparkled briefly across marble floors. Yet Sophie remained perfectly still beside the glowing birthday cake. Emily noticed her fingers slowly twisting the white napkin beneath the table. Daniel gestured towards Sophie warmly. "And of course none of this would matter without the strongest young woman I know." The ballroom looked towards Sophie expectantly. But instead of smiling, Sophie quietly stood from her chair. Silence immediately spread beneath the chandeliers again. Daniel's smile faltered slightly. "Sophie." She looked toward him with exhausted blue eyes. "Can everyone please stop talking about me like I am not standing here?" A few guests shifted awkwardly. Daniel lowered his champagne glass slowly. "Sweetheart, I was only trying to, I know." Sophie's voice stayed soft, which somehow made the pain inside it harder to ignore. That is the problem. The ballroom had gone completely silent now except for distant piano notes trembling through the air. Sophie glanced around the room, filled with wealthy strangers beneath crystal lights. Everyone keeps trying to make tonight perfect. Her eyes slowly moved toward the empty chair near the windows. But Mom is still gone. No one breathed loudly after that. Daniel's jaw tightened beneath the ballroom lights while several guests immediately looked away in discomfort. Emily stood frozen near the dessert station, holding a silver tray against her chest. Sophie looked back toward her father. "You removed every picture of her from the house except this one." Her voice trembled slightly now. "You never say her name anymore." Daniel stepped toward her carefully. "Sophie, not here." "Then where?" The question landed across the ballroom harder than shouting ever could have. "Because every time I try talking about her, everyone changes the subject." Snow drifted heavily outside the windows now while silence swallowed the ballroom whole. Daniel looked around at the guests staring toward them beneath the chandeliers and instinctively reached for control again. This is not the time. Sophie laughed softly through tears beginning to form again. You always say that. Then suddenly her eyes shifted toward Emily, standing quietly near the ballroom edge. She was the only person tonight who noticed Mom was missing. Several guests immediately looked toward the waitress. Daniel's expression hardened with visible embarrassment beneath the chandelier glow. Public vulnerability felt dangerous to men like him, especially in front of investors and cameras. Enough, Daniel said sharply. Sophie flinched slightly. Emily noticed immediately. The ballroom manager near the service station whispered nervously toward another employee, but nobody moved. Nobody knew how to interrupt grief once it finally spoke aloud. Daniel looked toward Emily next, frustration rising beneath his polished exterior. You had no right to involve yourself in this. The sentence echoed painfully through the silent ballroom. Emily remained calm despite dozens of wealthy strangers now watching her. I never tried to involve myself. Daniel stepped closer beneath the amber lights. Then why say anything to her at all? Emily looked briefly towards Sophie before answering softly. Because she looked lonely. Daniel almost laughed in disbelief. Lonely. His hand gestured sharply toward the ballroom surrounding them. My daughter is standing inside one of the most beautiful hotels in Manhattan, surrounded by people who love her. Emily nodded gently. Yes. Her blue eyes moved towards Sophie again. And she still feels alone. Silence crashed through the ballroom after that sentence. Sophie lowered her head immediately while tears slipped quietly down her face. Daniel stared at Emily like he wanted to reject the truth standing in front of him, but something inside him already knew she was right. Emily carefully placed the silver tray onto a nearby table before speaking one final time beneath the crystal chandeliers and soft winter light. Sometimes the worst loneliness is when everyone around you keeps trying to replace grief instead of sitting beside it. Nobody in the ballroom moved after hearing that. Not the investors, not the reporters, not even the musicians near the stage. And then, beneath the warm golden lights of her 16th birthday party, Sophie Whitmore suddenly began crying openly for the first time since her mother died. For several long seconds after Sophie Whitmore began crying, the crystal ballroom forgot how to breathe. The piano music near the stage had stopped completely. Champagne glasses remained frozen halfway toward lips. Investors, socialites, reporters, and hotel staff stood beneath the chandeliers watching 16 years of buried grief finally break open beneath golden light and falling snow outside the Manhattan windows. Sophie covered her mouth with trembling fingers as tears slipped freely down her face, but she no longer tried hiding them. Not anymore. I miss her, she whispered shakily. I miss her every single day. Daniel Whitmore stood motionless beside the birthday table while the words struck him harder than any public humiliation ever could. The billionaire had spent years trying to rebuild life around silence, because silence felt easier to manage than pain. But now his daughter was standing in front of an entire ballroom, exposing the loneliness hidden inside their perfect family. Sophie looked toward the empty chair near the windows again. Everyone stopped talking about Mom like she disappeared instead of died. Her voice cracked beneath the chandeliers. Even you. Daniel swallowed carefully while guests avoided eye contact around them. Emily Carter remained near the ballroom edge beside the dessert station, calm and still beneath the warm amber lighting. She did not step forward. She did not interrupt. Some moments only needed honesty to survive, not rescue. Daniel finally moved towards Sophie slowly. Sweetheart. But Sophie shook her head through tears. No. She looked up at him with years of exhaustion in her blue eyes. Do you know what hurts the most? Daniel's voice lowered carefully. Tell me. Sophie wiped her cheeks shakily. I feel like I lost both of you after Mom died. The sentence shattered whatever emotional distance Daniel still tried maintaining. Several guests quietly lowered their heads after hearing it. Even the ballroom staff near the service station looked visibly emotional now beneath the chandelier glow. Daniel stared at his daughter speechless, while memories he buried for years rose sharply back into focus. Hospital hallways. Winter mornings alone. Sophie crying behind locked bedroom doors while he drowned himself in business meetings because work felt easier than grief. Emily quietly watched his expression change from across the ballroom. Not anger anymore. Recognition. The kind that arrives painfully late. One investor near the front table whispered softly toward his wife, "Poor girl." Daniel slowly sat beside Sophie while the ballroom remained silent around them. "I thought protecting you meant helping you move forward." Sophie looked down at the untouched birthday cake glowing softly beside them. "You cannot move forward from someone if you never let yourself miss them." Snow drifted harder outside now, covering Manhattan streets in white silence while candlelight flickered across the photograph of Amelia Whitmore near the empty chair. Daniel finally looked toward the framed picture of his late wife beneath the chandeliers. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to look without immediately turning away. Sophie followed his eyes quietly. "I still talk to her sometimes," she admitted softly. Daniel's chest tightened. "You do?" Sophie nodded. "Mostly when nobody is around." Tears gathered in Daniel's eyes so subtly that only Emily noticed from across the ballroom. Powerful men became experts at hiding emotion, but grief always escaped eventually through the smallest cracks. Daniel looked back toward his daughter. "I did not know." Sophie gave a small broken laugh. "You stopped asking." Silence settled gently between them after that. Not cold silence this time. Honest silence. Across the ballroom, guests remained perfectly still, as if witnessing something far more important than the expensive celebration surrounding them. Emily quietly lifted a linen napkin from the serving station and walked slowly toward the Whitmore table beneath the chandelier light. Daniel noticed her approaching, but said nothing. Sophie accepted the napkin softly with trembling fingers. "Thank you." Emily smiled gently. "Of course." Daniel looked up toward her after several seconds. Pride still lingered in his expression, but something softer had finally broken through it tonight. "You embarrassed me in front of my guests." Several nearby people immediately tensed after hearing the sentence. Emily remained calm. "I was never trying to embarrass you." Daniel studied her quietly beneath the golden ballroom light. "Then why say those things?" Emily glanced briefly towards Sophie before answering. "Because grief becomes heavier when nobody says its name out loud." The ballroom remained silent again. Daniel looked toward the empty chair by the window once more, then toward the framed photograph beside the candles. Finally, he asked the question no billionaire should have needed a waitress to answer for him. "How do you help someone feel less alone after loss?" Emily's expression softened almost sadly. "You stop trying to fix their sadness." Snow swirled gently outside the towering glass windows while soft candlelight reflected against polished silver and crystal. Emily continued quietly. "You sit beside it with them instead." Sophie's tears returned immediately after hearing that. Not because the words were dramatic, because they were true. Daniel lowered his eyes slowly toward his hands resting against the edge of the table. Hands that built corporations, signed million-dollar contracts, controlled entire industries, yet somehow never learned how to simply sit beside his daughter's pain without trying to silence it. Near the ballroom entrance, several reporters quietly lowered their phones. The room no longer felt like a public event. It felt personal now, human. Daniel finally looked back toward Emily beneath the chandeliers. His voice had changed completely when he spoke again. Quieter, less guarded. "You loved someone once too, did not you?" Emily hesitated briefly before nodding. "My mother." Daniel understood immediately. Emily glanced toward Sophie softly. "The hardest part is not losing someone." Her eyes drifted toward the snowy windows beyond the ballroom. "It is watching the world continue normally afterward." Sophie suddenly stood from her chair and wrapped her arms tightly around her father without warning. Daniel froze in shock for half a second before slowly holding her back beneath the warm golden light. Guests quietly wiped tears. Even the musicians near the stage looked emotional now. And while snow continued falling softly across Manhattan beyond the windows, Daniel Whitmore finally realized the gentlest voice in the ballroom had been carrying the deepest truth all night. The embrace lasted only a few seconds beneath the chandeliers, but for Daniel Whitmore it felt like the first honest moment he had shared with his daughter in years. Sophie held tightly onto him while tears soaked quietly against the shoulder of his charcoal suit jacket. And for once the billionaire did not try to fix the situation, redirect the conversation, or regain control of the room. He simply stood there holding his daughter while snow drifted softly beyond the towering Manhattan windows. Around them, the crystal ballroom remained silent except for the distant sound of piano music returning carefully near the stage. Guests looked away respectfully now. as if everyone suddenly understood they were witnessing something too personal to interrupt. Emily Carter quietly stepped backward toward the service station after handing Sophie the linen napkin. She never wanted recognition, only peace. But Daniel noticed her retreating immediately. Something inside him no longer wanted her invisible. Sophie slowly released her father and wiped her face carefully beneath the warm golden light. Her mascara had smudged slightly, though somehow she looked younger now, more honest, less exhausted. Daniel brushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear gently, the way he used to years ago before grief turned every conversation between them into cautious silence. "I am sorry," he whispered softly. Sophie looked at him with surprise. "For what?" Daniel glanced briefly toward the empty chair near the windows. "For thinking avoiding pain was the same thing as helping you heal." Tears gathered in Sophie's eyes again, but this time she smiled faintly through them. "I think you were trying your best." Daniel lowered his eyes. "Maybe my best stopped being enough a long time ago." Nearby guests quietly resumed conversation beneath the chandeliers, though the atmosphere inside the ballroom had completely changed now. Earlier the room felt elegant, polished, controlled. Now it felt human, fragile, real. Emily returned to arranging dessert plates near the service station while trying not to focus on the emotional weight still lingering around the ballroom. But another waitress beside her whispered softly, "You changed that family tonight." Emily shook her head gently. No. Her eyes drifted towards Sophie and Daniel near the birthday table. They finally started listening to each other. Across the ballroom, Daniel slowly stood beside his daughter and looked toward the service station where Emily worked quietly beneath soft amber lighting. For several seconds, he simply watched her. Not as staff, not as background, as a person who somehow carried more emotional wisdom into the room than executives, therapists, and luxury surrounded by wealth ever had. One investor approached Daniel carefully with a polite smile. "Beautiful speech earlier, Daniel." Daniel barely glanced toward him. "I did not give a speech." The investor nodded towards Sophie softly. "No," he smiled gently. "Your daughter did." Daniel looked back towards Sophie and realized the man was right. For years he had spent millions trying to protect his daughter from sadness, while never giving her permission to speak honestly about it. Sophie quietly sat back down beside the birthday cake now, but this time she moved a framed photograph of her mother closer to the center of the table instead of leaving it hidden near the candles. Daniel noticed immediately. Such a small gesture. Yet somehow it carried more healing than all the expensive decorations surrounding them tonight. Slowly, Daniel crossed the ballroom toward the service station beneath the chandeliers, while several guests subtly followed him with their eyes. Emily looked up as he approached. "Mr. Whitmore." His expression remained serious, but not cold anymore. "Walk with me for a moment." Emily hesitated briefly before nodding politely. Together they moved toward the quieter hallway near the balcony windows where snow covered Manhattan in soft white light outside. The distant ballroom music echoed gently behind them. Daniel stopped near the glass overlooking the city below. "You said something earlier." Emily waited quietly. Daniel looked out toward the snowy skyline. "About loneliness becoming worse when people stop saying someone's name." Emily nodded slightly. "Yes." Daniel slipped one hand into his pocket slowly. "I stopped saying Amelia's name because hearing it hurt too much." His voice lowered almost painfully. "Eventually I convinced myself it hurts Sophie too." Emily listened without interrupting. Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile beneath his breath. Turns out silence hurt her more. Snow swirled softly against the dark Manhattan night beyond the windows, while warm hallway lights reflected across the polished marble floor. Emily finally spoke gently. "Children usually do not need perfect parents after loss." Daniel looked toward her. "What do they need?" Emily's expression softened. "Parents willing to grieve beside them." The billionaire lowered his eyes after hearing that. He looked exhausted now in a way money could never solve. "I built an entire empire because I thought success could protect my family from pain." Emily glanced toward the ballroom, where Sophie sat quietly beside the glowing birthday cake. "Pain still finds people." Daniel nodded faintly. "Yes." Silence settled between them again. Comfortable this time. Honest. Then unexpectedly Daniel asked, "How old were you when your mother died?" Emily blinked slightly at the question. 19. Daniel studied her carefully beneath the warm hallway light. "And who helped you through it?" Emily smiled sadly. A waitress at a diner in Brooklyn. Daniel looked surprised. Emily glanced toward the snowy city outside. She used to bring me coffee during my night shifts and let me talk about my mother even when customers were loud and the world kept moving. Her eyes softened with memory. Sometimes healing begins with someone simply listening long enough for grief to breathe. Daniel stood very still after hearing that. Somewhere behind them, the ballroom guests began softly singing Happy Birthday again as musicians restarted the celebration carefully. But now the song sounded different. Gentler. Real. Daniel looked back toward Emily beneath the amber hallway light. I judged you the moment you walked into this room. Emily smiled faintly. Most people do. The honesty in her voice carried no bitterness, only experience. Daniel exhaled slowly while snow continued falling beyond the glass. Then quietly, almost like a confession, the billionaire finally said the one thing he had not sincerely said to anyone in a very long time. Thank you for seeing my daughter when I stopped knowing how. The second version of the birthday song sounded quieter than the first one. Not weaker, more honest. The guests inside the crystal ballroom no longer sang like people attending a luxury event. They sang carefully now, softly beneath the chandeliers while snow drifted outside the Manhattan windows and candlelight reflected against crystal glasses and polished marble floors. Sophie Whitmore sat beside her birthday cake, holding the framed photograph of her mother gently in both hands while her father stood nearby, watching her with an expression that no longer looked controlled. Daniel Whitmore looked uncertain for the first time in years. Human. Emily Carter remained near the hallway entrance after their conversation, allowing distance between herself and the family now that the ballroom atmosphere had settled into something quieter and far more personal. The billionaire's apology still lingered softly in her mind, not because powerful men apologizing impressed her, because sincere regret always carried a certain loneliness. Sophie glanced toward her father while the guests finished singing. Can we do something different? Daniel blinked slightly. Different how? Sophie looked down at the photograph again. Can we talk about Mom tonight instead of pretending she is not supposed to be here? Silence spread gently through the nearby tables. But this time nobody looked uncomfortable. Something about Sophie's honesty had given the entire ballroom permission to stop pretending grief was impolite. Daniel slowly pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. What do you want to say about her? Sophie smiled faintly through lingering tears. Remember how she used to dance while cooking breakfast? Daniel laughed softly before he could stop himself. A real laugh. Small, surprised, almost painful in its sincerity. She was terrible at dancing. Sophie nodded immediately. Horrible. Several guests nearby smiled warmly while listening now. Sophie continued softly, but she always played old jazz records every Sunday morning anyway. Daniel's eyes lowered toward the table as memories slowly returned to places inside him he had locked away after Amelia's death. She burned pancakes almost every weekend. Sophie laughed through another tear and blamed the toaster. The two of them sat quietly smiling beneath the chandeliers while snow fell softly beyond the ballroom windows. Emily watched from across the room, recognizing the exact moment grief stopped feeling like an enemy and started becoming memory again. One of the older women seated near the ballroom stage gently wiped tears from her eyes while listening. Another guest quietly lowered his champagne glass without speaking. Nobody in the room cared about luxury anymore tonight. They cared about truth. Daniel looked toward the framed photograph beside the candles. Your mother hated these kinds of parties. Sophie immediately smiled wider. She used to call them expensive theater. Daniel shook his head softly beneath the warm golden light. She only attended because I kept asking. Sophie's voice lowered gently. I think she came because she loved you. That sentence silenced Daniel completely. For years he convinced himself grief became easier by avoiding memories. But now every memory of Amelia suddenly felt warm instead of unbearable. Sad, yes, but alive. Near the ballroom edge, Emily quietly adjusted the silverware on a nearby table while the ballroom manager approached her slowly. Mr. Whitmore requested that you stay until the event ends. Emily looked surprised. Did he say why? The manager smiled faintly. No. His eyes drifted toward Sophie and Daniel speaking softly near the birthday cake. But I think he finally understands what tonight was really supposed to be about. Near midnight, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly while guests settled into quieter conversations and soft jazz replaced the earlier piano melodies. The atmosphere no longer resembled a billionaire celebration. It felt more like a family finally learning how to breathe again after years underwater. Sophie eventually stood from the table and walked slowly toward Emily beneath the amber chandelier glow. Several guests subtly watched her cross the ballroom. Emily straightened politely. "Are you all right?" Sophie nodded softly. "Better." She hesitated briefly before adding, "Thank you for saying her name." Emily's expression softened immediately. "Your mother mattered." Sophie looked down for a moment. Most people stopped acting like she did because it made Dad sad. Emily glanced toward Daniel, standing near the windows, speaking quietly with guests. People often confuse avoiding pain with healing. Sophie smiled faintly. "You say things differently than everyone else here." Emily laughed quietly beneath the warm ballroom lights. "That is probably because I do not belong here." Sophie looked around the crystal ballroom thoughtfully. "Maybe that is why you could see what nobody else did." Before Emily could answer, Daniel slowly approached them beneath the chandeliers with both hands resting calmly in his pockets. He looked exhausted now, but lighter somehow, less armored. Sophie glanced between them before speaking carefully. "Dad." Daniel nodded gently toward her. "Would you give me a minute with Emily?" Sophie smiled knowingly before returning toward the birthday table. For several seconds, Daniel simply stood beside Emily, watching the snowfall beyond the glass windows. Manhattan glittered beneath winter light outside, while jazz music drifted softly through the ballroom behind them. Finally, Daniel spoke quietly. "I spent 3 years trying to keep my daughter from falling apart." Emily remained silent beside him. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I never realized she was waiting for permission to grieve." Emily looked towards Sophie, laughing softly with one of the older guests near the cake now. People heal differently once they stop hiding sadness from each other. Daniel studied Emily carefully beneath the warm hallway light reflecting from the ballroom. "You know what surprises me the most?" Emily glanced toward him. "What?" A faint sad smile crossed his face. "You walked into this room carrying a serving tray." His eyes drifted toward Sophie, and somehow became the only adult willing to tell the truth. Emily lowered her eyes modestly. Sometimes people listen more carefully to those they consider invisible. Daniel stared at her after hearing that. The sentence stayed with him because he knew it was true. Wealth had surrounded him with people who protected his comfort for years. But comfort was never the same thing as honesty. Near the ballroom stage, Sophie suddenly called toward them softly. "Dad." Daniel turned immediately. Sophie stood beside the birthday cake, smiling gently beneath the chandeliers, while holding the framed photograph of Amelia Whitmore against her chest. "Will you dance with me?" Daniel froze slightly. Amelia used to ask him the same question at every event before her illness. For a brief second, grief flickered across his expression again. But this time he did not run from it. Slowly, the billionaire walked toward his daughter beneath the warm golden light, while snow continued falling quietly outside the Manhattan skyline. And as the music softened around them, Emily Carter stood silently near the ballroom windows, realizing that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can offer another human being is simply permission to remember without fear. Daniel Whitmore had attended thousands of elegant events throughout his life, but as he stepped onto the ballroom floor with his daughter beneath the chandeliers that night, he realized he could barely remember the last time something inside a room truly mattered to him. The jazz music drifting softly through the crystal ballroom carried warmth now instead of performance, while snow continued falling beyond the Manhattan windows like quiet white light settling over the city. Sophie Whitmore placed one hand carefully against her father's shoulder while he gently held her other hand, and for a moment neither of them moved. They simply stood there together beneath the golden glow of the ballroom lights, surrounded by guests who suddenly felt less important than the fragile honesty finally returning between them. "Mom always said you were a terrible dancer," Sophie whispered softly. Daniel smiled faintly. "Your mother enjoyed humiliating me in public." Sophie laughed quietly through the last traces of earlier tears, and the sound alone nearly broke him all over again. He had forgotten how rare her laughter became after Amelia died. The jazz melody slowly guided them across the marble floor, while conversations around the ballroom softened respectfully. Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. Near the ballroom windows, Emily Carter stood quietly beside the service station, holding a folded linen napkin in her hands, while watching the father and daughter dance beneath the chandeliers. She noticed the way Daniel looked at Sophie now. Not distracted anymore. Not divided between business calls and appearances. Present. Fully present. And sometimes that alone could begin healing a family. One of the older guests approached Emily gently near the dessert table. You knew exactly what to say tonight. Emily shook her head softly. Not exactly. Her eyes remained on Sophie and Daniel. I just think people need permission to stop pretending they are fine. The older woman nodded slowly while emotion gathered quietly in her eyes. Most rooms like this are built on pretending. Emily smiled sadly. Yes. Across the ballroom floor, Sophie rested her head lightly against her father's shoulder while the music continued. Do you remember the lake house in Vermont? She asked softly. Daniel's expression softened immediately. The one with the blue porch swing? Sophie nodded. Mom used to wake us up before sunrise there. Daniel laughed under his breath. Because she wanted to watch fog move across the water. Sophie smiled faintly. She said mornings looked quieter there. Daniel looked down at his daughter carefully. You remember a lot. Sophie hesitated before answering. I was scared I would forget her if I stopped. The sentence landed gently between them, while warm chandelier light reflected against the marble floor beneath their slow movements. Daniel closed his eyes briefly after hearing it. For years he had hidden every painful reminder of Amelia, believing grief faded through distance. But Sophie spent those same years protecting every memory because she feared distance would erase her mother completely. Two people grieving the same loss in opposite directions. Near the ballroom stage, several guests quietly began leaving for the night, while others remained seated simply watching the atmosphere inside the room transform from luxury into something softer and deeply human. Even the hotel staff moved more slowly now beneath the amber light, as if everyone sensed the evening no longer belonged to wealth or status. It belonged to healing. As the song ended, Sophie stayed close to her father for another second before stepping back gently. Thank you for dancing. Daniel brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face. Thank you for asking. Sophie glanced toward Emily near the windows. Can she stay for cake? Daniel followed her gaze slowly. The old version of himself would have instinctively separated staff from guests, divided rooms by status and role. But tonight those invisible walls suddenly felt embarrassing. Small. Daniel nodded quietly. Yes. Sophie smiled immediately and walked across the ballroom toward Emily while candlelight flickered softly across the tables around them. Emily looked surprised when Sophie approached. Everything all right? Sophie nodded warmly. Better than all right. Then she asked quietly, would you sit with us for cake? Emily blinked in surprise. I should probably continue working. Sophie smiled gently. Please. Daniel slowly approached them beneath the chandeliers, his expression calmer now than at any point earlier that night. She is right, he said softly toward Emily. You should join us. Emily hesitated briefly. Mr. Whitmore, I am still staff here. Daniel looked around the ballroom filled with wealthy guests, polished crystal, and expensive perfection before answering quietly. Tonight, I think that distinction mattered far less than I believed. Sophie smiled wider after hearing that. Emily finally nodded gently. Together they returned toward the birthday table, near the windows where the framed photograph of Amelia Whitmore still rested beside the candles and untouched silver roses decorating the cake. Daniel carefully pulled out a chair for Emily before sitting across from her beside Sophie. The gesture did not go unnoticed by the remaining guests nearby. For the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore looked less like a billionaire and more like a father trying to rebuild something fragile before it disappeared completely. Sophie lit the birthday candles again herself this time, while snow drifted softly beyond the Manhattan skyline outside. Daniel glanced toward Amelia's photograph beneath the candlelight. Your mother would have loved tonight eventually, he admitted quietly. Sophie smiled sadly. After complaining about it for 2 hours first. Emily laughed softly before she could stop herself, and surprisingly Daniel laughed too. A real laugh. Warm. Human. The kind that belonged in homes instead of boardrooms. Sophie closed her eyes gently before blowing out the candles. Nobody rushed to applaud afterward. Nobody reached for cameras. The moment felt too sincere for performance now. As candle smoke curled softly into the warm ballroom air, Daniel looked toward Emily across the table. You changed something tonight that money could not. Emily lowered her eyes modestly. I think your daughter changed it herself. Daniel glanced toward Sophie, quietly smiling beside her mother's photograph. Then back toward Emily. Maybe. His voice softened almost thoughtfully. But sometimes people only find their voice after someone finally listens to the silence first. Outside, snow continued falling over Manhattan beneath the dark winter sky, while inside the crystal ballroom the lights glowed warmer than before, as though the room itself understood that grief did not disappear when hidden away. It only waited patiently for someone gentle enough to speak to it without fear. By the time the final guests began leaving the crystal ballroom, Manhattan had disappeared beneath thick snowfall, and the city outside looked softer than usual, almost quiet enough to forgive people for the things they carried too long alone. The chandeliers still glowed warmly above the marble floors while hotel staff carefully cleared champagne glasses and folded linen napkins beneath fading jazz music. Yet the atmosphere inside the ballroom no longer resembled the beginning of the evening. Earlier the room had been beautiful but emotionally hollow, filled with expensive smiles and practiced conversations. Now it felt smaller somehow, more human. Sophie Whitmore sat beside the nearly finished birthday cake, talking softly with her father, while the framed photograph of Amelia remained at the center of the table where it belonged. Daniel Whitmore listened carefully to every word his daughter spoke now, as if afraid silence might return if he stopped paying attention even for a moment. Emily Carter quietly gathered empty dessert plates near the ballroom windows while snow drifted beyond the glass in slow white patterns against the Manhattan skyline. She moved calmly through the room the same way she had all night. No dramatic gestures, no expectation of praise, just quiet grace beneath warm golden light. Sophie suddenly stood from the table and crossed the ballroom toward her one final time. "Are you leaving soon?" Emily smiled softly. "My shift ends in about 10 minutes. Sophie hesitated briefly before asking, "Will I ever see you again?" Emily glanced toward the snowy city outside. New York is smaller than people think. Sophie laughed quietly. "Mom used to say that too." Emily's eyes softened immediately after hearing Amelia mentioned so naturally now. That alone felt like healing. Daniel slowly approached them beneath the chandeliers with his coat folded over one arm, while the remaining guests quietly prepared to leave. The billionaire no longer carried the sharp emotional distance that followed him earlier that night. Grief still existed inside him. It always would. But now it looked shared instead of hidden. Daniel stopped beside Emily carefully. "I owe you an apology." Emily shook her head lightly. "That is not necessary." "Yes," Daniel answered quietly. "It is." Snow reflected softly against the ballroom windows behind them, while hotel staff dimmed portions of the room one section at a time. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. "Tonight I treated you like your voice mattered less because of the uniform you wore." Emily remained silent. Daniel looked towards Sophie standing beside them. "Meanwhile, you understood my daughter better than I did." Sophie gently slipped her hand into her father's arm while listening. Daniel gave a faint, sad smile beneath the amber lights. "That is not something easy for a man like me to admit." Emily smiled kindly. "Most honest things are not easy." Daniel almost laughed softly after hearing that. Then he reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat jacket and removed a small white envelope. "This is for you." Emily immediately shook her head. "I cannot accept that." Daniel looked at her carefully. "It is not charity." Emily hesitated. Daniel continued quietly. "It is gratitude." Sophie nodded softly beside him. "Please." Emily finally accepted the envelope politely, but did not open it. She already understood the amount inside probably exceeded several months of salary. Yet somehow the money mattered less than the sincerity in Daniel's expression while offering it. The billionaire looked toward the ballroom one final time. "Do you know something strange?" Emily tilted her head slightly. "What?" Daniel's eyes drifted toward the birthday table where Amelia's photograph still rested beside the candles. "This is the first party in years that actually felt like my wife was here." Sophie lowered her eyes emotionally after hearing that. Emily glanced softly toward the photograph too. Maybe because tonight people finally let themselves remember her honestly. Silence settled gently between the three of them while snow continued falling outside. Not painful silence anymore. Peaceful silence. The kind that arrives after truth finally stops fighting to be heard. Near the ballroom entrance, the hotel manager approached quietly. "Miss Carter, your ride is here." Emily nodded politely. She picked up her coat from the service station and slipped it carefully over her black waitress uniform while Sophie watched her with visible affection now. Before leaving, Emily looked towards Sophie one last time. "Talk about your mother often." Sophie nodded immediately. "I will." Emily smiled softly. "That is how love stays alive after loss." Daniel lowered his eyes briefly after hearing the sentence. Then, unexpectedly, Sophie stepped forward and hugged Emily tightly beneath the warm chandelier light. Emily froze slightly in surprise before gently hugging her back. Daniel watched silently, realizing that the most important person to walk into his daughter's life tonight had entered carrying a silver tray and wearing a name tag most people in the ballroom never bothered reading. When Sophie stepped back, her eyes glistened again. "Thank you for seeing me." Emily touched her shoulder gently. "You were never invisible." Then Emily turned toward Daniel. The billionaire extended his hand formally at first, then stopped halfway, and instead gave her something much rarer from men like him: vulnerability. "I hope someday I become the kind of parent my daughter needed all along." Emily's expression softened warmly. "You already started tonight." Daniel nodded slowly while emotion flickered quietly behind his eyes. Emily walked toward the ballroom exit afterward beneath fading chandelier light while snow swirled softly outside the hotel doors. Halfway to the entrance, she paused briefly and looked back one final time. Sophie and Daniel stood together beside the birthday table, talking softly beneath the warm golden glow, Amelia's photograph resting between them instead of hidden away. A family still grieving, still imperfect, but finally grieving together instead of alone. Emily smiled faintly to herself before disappearing into the snowy Manhattan night. Behind her, the crystal ballroom lights slowly dimmed one by one until only the candles near Amelia's photograph continued glowing softly in the quiet room. And somewhere beneath the falling snow outside, Daniel Whitmore finally understood something wealth had never taught him. Sometimes the gentlest voice in the room is the one carrying the deepest truth.